Our second speaker is Professor Leon Stryker. Professor Stryker holds an NHMRC Senior Research Fellowship and is the Director of Research at the School of Physiotherapy at Curtin University in Western Australia. The rapid changes in technology we each use every day are having a substantial impact on our health, and this is what Leon is particularly interested in, coming from an ergonomic standpoint. His current research focuses on the impact of technology on health and how to prevent lifestyle disorders related to inactivity. Please welcome Leon Stryker.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you for the opportunity and the honour of speaking here this morning. It was interesting for our first speaker to be talking about how humans have evolved to run. And in the end, he was talking about some of the other activities that we also do, and my presentation kind of picks up on that, because all of us aren't marathon runners. I couldn't do that. I'm hoping that as I age, I'll come into my own and be able to do it a bit later on. But there's a lot of us that aren't able to do long endurance running, and the proportion of the human race that is able to do that is quite small. A lot of us have disabilities and disorders that mean that we aren't able to participate in running and other vigorous activity, and I think that's what our third speaker is going to talk about. So I kind of think of the three professors, which I was a bit worried that sounded like the three monkeys when we were being introduced, but the three professors are going to be talking about an affirmation of the role of physiotherapy, and that we have a role in promoting movement and activity in humans, no matter what their capability, through from long-distance endurance runners through to people that have disabilities that make it very difficult for them to run. For 60 years, we've been gathering evidence about the benefits of running and other moderate and vigorous physical activities for current humans. This is a study from about 30 years ago that shows the relative risk of all-cause mortality related to how active those individuals were. And you can see that for the group up on the right of individuals who are more active in their daily lives, they had a reduced risk of death, which is a pretty important health outcome. Before I go any further, I'd like to make it clear about some distinctions between physical activity, fitness, and fatness. Physical activity is about movement. It's about the energy that we expend to move around, and it's usually classified in terms of intensity. Running's a pretty high intensity activity, and so that would be called vigorous physical activity. In contrast, fitness is a range of constructs that includes things like flexibility, motor coordination, strength, power, anaerobic capacity, and aerobic capacity. And sometimes it includes body composition measures like lean body mass and adiposity or fatness. Early research tended to use aerobic capacity and physical activity as synonymous, but they're actually, while they're related, they're actually quite separate. One's a behaviour that you participate in, and the other one is a capacity that you have that's to the majority extent is determined by your genes, what gender you are, what size you are, and other genetic characteristics. So no matter how much we try, and my favourite sport is cycling rather than running because I can't run for nuts, but in cycling there's no way I'm going to be a Cadell Evans because I haven't got the genes, but even me and others in the audience can gain the health benefits from being physically active, even if we haven't got the genes to be a world-class athlete. So for this last 60 years, we've been collating evidence about the benefits of being moderate and vigorous physically active, and national governments have funded reviews to put all this information together, and this is something that all physiotherapists are very familiar with, that people can gain physical, mental and social benefits from regularly participating in moderate and vigorous physical activity. National governments have also put money into getting clear what the guidelines and guidance should be so that people know what type of activity and how much of that activity they should perform to gain those health benefits. So in Australia we have 3 guidelines for moderate and vigorous physical activity. For adults, the guideline is that we should be participating in at least 30 minutes per day on most, if not all days, of moderate and vigorous intensity physical activity. For older adults, it's 30 minutes per day still, but you can see they've taken out the vigorous component and they're just talking about the moderate physical activity per day. For children, we're expecting them to be twice as active as adults, and we're suggesting that guidelines are for them to be doing 60 minutes per day of moderate and vigorous physical activity. Taking this evidence, the national governments know that you can get health benefits from the population participating in this sort of regular physical activity. And so there's been a long history of national governments and other organisations promoting people being physically active so they can gain those health benefits. And in Australia, the most iconic one has been the Life Be In It with the central character Norm from 30 years ago, and you'll see Eric and the Swap It campaign sort of more common now, but here's a bit of nostalgia for those that are old like me.
Splash, 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 hit, 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 hit. Hit, 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 throw, 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 throw. Run, 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 run. Roll, 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 roll. Bend, 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 bend.
Call Norm to find out how you can be in it. Sport?
Don't you just love that 80s music and colour scheme? The thing that was critical in there, of course, was a kangaroo that they were showing, which they obviously had looked at your research ahead of time to realise that the energy efficiency of kangaroos was like humans. Oh, sorry. It was so good, I nearly wanted to watch it again. Okay, a lot of organisations have spent money on this, but is it effective? The current opinion is that to be effective in trying to get more people to be active on a regular basis requires consistent messages, and that those messages are sustained over not just years, but decades as well. And that's interesting as a physiotherapist, because if you think about lots of the opportunities that you have on a one-to-one basis with your clients, that impact that you can have is a much stronger impact than these mass media campaigns, even though they cost quite a lot of money to do. Just coming back to the mass media campaigns, is there evidence that they're effective? Well, yes, there's good evidence that we can change people's knowledge about physical activity and the health benefits from that. And there's also evidence that we can change people's intentions to exercise. And I had a good intention to exercise this morning, but it didn't actually eventuate. And that's what the evidence tends to show, is that there's little evidence that these mass media campaigns can actually increase the participation in regular physical activity in the long term. So what sort of proportion of our population is regularly active in moderate and vigorous physical activity? Well, for adults in Australia, it's about 38% are meeting that guideline of 30 minutes on most days. The last census data that's available from 2007 and 2008 has actually shown a decline since the previous one in 2001, and it will be interesting to see how you all scored in the data that they collected this year from you. In terms of children, if we look at how much they're succeeding in meeting those guidelines on 4 successive days, about the same proportion, 32% of children are actually being 60 minutes or more of moderate and vigorous physical activity on each of those days. Internationally, if we use the stricter guideline, which requires that moderate and vigorous physical activity to be accumulated in bouts of at least 10 minutes, they're only about 5 to 10% of the population in the USA and Canada, and probably in Australia, if we use the same metric, are actually meeting those guidelines. So what are the reasons that people give for not being physically active? And as a physiotherapist, I'm sure you've heard these on many occasions. You can see the list up there, and that lack of time is the one that's often mentioned a lot. The people on the Serengeti had all day to chase down that kudu because they depended on that to eat. Here we have other things like banking and going to work and getting money and those sorts of things, which tend to be the reason that people say get in the road and limit their time. The really nice thing that I'd like to focus on some of the rest of the talk is some of those activities that the first speaker was talking about, other than the running ones, that actually give you other opportunities to be active that maybe aren't so time dependent and are easy to fit in with people's daily time. So let's look at the different levels of physical activity. As I mentioned at the beginning, physical activity tends to be defined by the level of intensity of the activity, and with the amount of energy you expend while you're resting, for example, sitting there at the moment, is usually defined as 1 metabolic equivalent, or 1 MET. So that's things like sitting and lying. Light activity is between 1 and 3 times that amount of energy expenditure, and that will be things like slow walking and household chores like washing the dishes. Moderate intensity exercise is 3 to 6 METs, and that's more like fast walking and vacuuming, particularly if you do it because you like it so much and try to do it quickly like I do. For the vigorous activity, more like running and stair walking and playing basketball, that's more than 6 METs. Traditionally, physical activity research has concentrated on the moderate and vigorous end of that activity scale, but recently there's been more interest in the light activity and the health benefits potentially related to that. In a study of 50,000 nurses, they found that for every 2 more hours that nurses were doing of standing and walking, there was a 9% reduction in obesity and a 12% reduction in their diabetes. In a large Australian diabetes study, they found that light physical activity, so that's slow walking, standing and doing the dishes, that type of intensity, was related to blood glucose levels. And the really interesting thing about this study is that it was one of the first to show that that health benefit was gained independent of the amount of moderate and vigorous physical activity that person was doing. So even if that person was running 30 minutes a day, meeting the guidelines, if they had more light activity in their day, they still had better blood glucose levels. In a large US study called the NHANE study, they've found that light physical activity is related to triglycerides and a whole range of other risk factors for metabolic syndromes. And again, the really interesting thing is that this is independent of the amount of moderate and vigorous physical activity. So there's some really good news for those of you that think that you can't run for 30 minutes a day, is that you can gain health benefits from increasing the amount of light physical activity in your day. So recent physical activity campaigns in Australia have started to pick up on that, and this is one that you wouldn't see comes from Western Australia.
I started taking my bike rather than the car for trips to the shops, and then I found I really enjoyed cycling. And the bonus was, I found a way to fit into last year's jeans.
I used to feel run down and low on energy, so my wife took me on her morning walks. I found it keeps me feeling alert all day. And we found time to talk.
Find 30 minutes physical activity every day. Find tips at find30everyday.com.
And you can see the intensity level of the activity that was being modelled there wouldn't be what you'd call moderate and vigorous. It was that light activity. That was a backup video in case the first one didn't work, so I had a bit of problems with it. Okay, I'd finally like to concentrate on a major health hazard that is prevalent in the world today. When we think of major health hazards, we tend to think of really dramatic TV events like the nuclear power plant explosion in Japan. And that was some of the scariest TV footage that I've ever seen. However, there's something that's killing far more Australians each year than that, and it's the chair. Now, don't freak out, and the guild person's not here because they would totally freak out because you're actually sitting on one of those right now. So this kills more people worldwide than nuclear has ever killed. That's a pretty scary thought, and it sort of links in with this 21st century lifestyle that our first speaker sort of talked about, that we're not running around chasing kudu around. A lot of us are spending a lot of our time sitting there. And I'm sorry that we're imposing a health threat on you by asking you to sit there while I'm talking to you. What we do know, particularly over the last 5 years, even though the very early research on physical activity was sort of done on London bus conductors versus drivers and found that people that were sitting were actually at higher risk, we've tended to forget about that for 50 years and only come back to it in the last 5 years. We now know that sedentary behaviour is linked to increased risk of all-cause mortality, to a lot of chronic disease and a lot of chronic disease risk factors. And again, these risk factors are independent of whether you're getting that moderate and vigorous 30 minutes a day exercise. Looking at some Australian data about how sedentary we are, because this is something that is really common now. So you can see here that 2/3 of Australian workers' days are sedentary. Just over a quarter is light intensity, and 4% is moderate and vigorous in the workday. If you compare that to a Kalahari bushman's day, it's a very different picture. So we may have evolved to be a lot more active, but our lifestyle now has actually got us very sedentary, and our work in particular is forcing us to be sedentary. If you look at what's happened with the proportion of the workforce that was in physically active jobs 50 years ago and is now in a sedentary job, then that's increasing dramatically. And that's true even in industries which we think of as being very physically demanding, like mining and forestry. A lot of those jobs are now sitting in a control room or in a machine operating hydraulic controls. There are also groups of us in our society who are at particular risk. And so here's the same data from people working in call centres. Now, if you think of chicken and egg production, you've got these little chickens cooped up in a tiny little cage so they make eggs for you to have for breakfast this morning. Call centre workers are literally tethered to the desk and the computer that they're working on. They are tied to the chair. If these were animals, the RSPCA would be getting really worried. Over 80% of their day is spent sitting, and they have to do that to do their job. They're just one occupational example of a number of other groups that have limited capacity potentially to do moderate and vigorous physical activity, but certainly have an increased exposure in sedentary behaviour. And patient groups are another group which we'll hear a bit more about as the third speaker, I think. So colleagues in Curtin University, and I'm sure many of you are interested in patient groups and how active they can be, and a lot of the role of physiotherapists with chronic disease and acute exacerbations is getting people up and active again. Here's some data from a Brazilian study. On the top showing the proportion of their days for healthy subjects spent in sitting and in lying, 42% and 4%. Contrasting that to a group of people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and you can see that there's a 10% increase in the amount of the time in the day, this is wake time, not sleep time, that they spend sitting, and an increase in the amount of time that they spend lying as well. And that's when people are in a stable, good phase of the COPD. When they're in an exacerbation, this graph shows the red horizontal line is the amount of normal activity, sedentary activity for these people. When they're in an acute exacerbation, they increase the amount of sitting that they have. So when you're thinking about managing patients, we know that bed rest is a bad thing. We need to roll people so they don't get pressure sores. We need to encourage them to be active more. Being sedentary and having sustained periods of sedentary behaviour fundamentally changes the physiology in the person's body and adds to their ill health and effects on top of the initial condition that they have. Besides the total amount of sedentary behaviour that people accumulate over the day, the pattern that they accumulate it in is also important. If you accumulate it in long bouts of 30 to 60 minutes plus, like you're doing now, I'm sorry, then there's an increased risk of increased waist circumference, increased BMI, increase in triglycerides, and increase in 2-hour plasma glucose levels. And again, that's independent of the amount of moderate and vigorous physical activity. So your risk this morning of sitting here for a long period of time is regardless of whether you went for a run this morning or not. And it's also independent of the total amount of time that you're sitting during the day. So this pattern of activity is really important. I'd like to give you an example from a postdoc researcher. This is an accelerometer reading, which is like a step counter, the person more on their hips, and measures the amount of activity of their trunk during the day. And the time scale goes from 5 o'clock in the morning through to midnight. And you can see this person had read the literature and knows the health benefits of being moderate and vigorously physically active, and so they went for a run before work. You can see after work, they had a couple of very short periods when they actually hit a moderate level of activity, perhaps walking quickly from the car to the house when they got home. However, the thing that you'll really notice is these long periods of sustained no activity or sedentariness, where they were sitting at work, reading their articles, writing their papers, doing good work for the university's Research Performance Index, but at the detriment to their health. This pattern of activity is quite a new thing that's coming up in the research, and we're working with a group in Sweden in coming up with ways in trying to capture that pattern of activity. And this is one of the ways that we're trying to capture that pattern, because that pattern's obviously important. So on this graph on the right-hand side, you can see those 4 levels of activity intensity. Along the front, you can see how long they've held that intensity for, and the height of the spikes are what percentage of their day is done in that activity and for that duration. What's really noticeable about this is that tiny little spike at the back there is their run in the morning. So you can just see how, in terms of the whole day, how small a proportion of the time that is. In contrast to that, these 2 columns in the front here are how much time they were spending sitting for at least 30 minutes or at least 60 minutes at one time without an interruption. And we know that these are linked to poor health outcomes. That's an adult researcher. You'd expect them to be sitting at a computer and working really hard, but surely that's different for children. So if we go back to this graph of Australian adults and show you a comparison data from a study we've just done with Australian children, these are 10 to 12-year-old children, late primary school, before they've hit teenage years when physical activity tends to decline. And when you look at the numbers between how sedentary the children are and the adults are, that's scarily similar. There's a little bit of hope with the children being having a little bit more moderate and vigorous activity, but there's this huge proportion of their day that is spent sedentary. looking at their pattern of their day, again using the same type of graph that we looked at before with intensity and the duration of that intensity, and this time the height is minutes, you can see the back column in Vigorous, on average they weren't really getting any minutes of vigorous activity for that group. But again, this front corner, the amount of sedentary time that children are spending at least 30 minutes at a time, if not 60 minutes at a time, is quite a substantial proportion of their day. And what really worries me is that this is our next generation. We're teaching them health behaviours, and at the moment in schools, we're teaching them a poor health behaviour of sitting for sustained periods. So in summary, the beneficial effects that we know of activity are that more running and other moderate and vigorous activity is good for you, particularly if you accumulate that in bouts of at least 10 minutes. Some of the new information that we have is that light physical activity is an additional health benefit, regardless of whether you're gaining the health benefit from the moderate and vigorous physical activity. What's really clear now, and what I think is a really big 21st century problem for us, is that we have that less sedentary behaviour is a separate health risk, and particularly if that's accumulated in bouts of 30 minutes or more. In summary, any movement then can be beneficial, and it's this variation in movement, which was a nice point that was at the end of the last talk, where people weren't meant to just do marathons with running non-stop, but this variety of movement is something that I know from current research on health risks, and it looks like we should have known it for millions of years as humans, so I'm a bit slow coming to the party with that, my apologies. The nice thing about it is that this opens up new benefits, new opportunities for health benefits. Even if people don't think they can do a marathon, they can still increase the amount of light activity and decrease the amount of sustained sedentariness in their lives. So the implications for physiotherapy are that this is just another evidence base that shows the importance of activity, any activity, for health. And as physiotherapists, one more thing. The Australian College of Sports Medicine has just released the Australian version of the Exercise is Medicine website, which is a great website which has got really good resources for individuals and for healthcare professionals. But I think it's a bit too narrow in that I think we should be looking at more broadly at activity is related to health, not just exercise prescription. As physiotherapists, we understand activity. We are movement. We're professionals that understand the physiology, the biomechanics, the health benefits of that. And I think that this new understanding that we have about the different levels of activity and the health benefits that can be accumulated by that shows that we have a vital role in enhancing the activity for all, regardless of their capabilities, and thus improving the health for all. To finish, I'd like to acknowledge the colleagues that helped provide some information for the presentation for me, and the NHMRC for funding my fellowship. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Just a quick summary. Professor Lieberman told us that we were made to move and to run. Leon's then reinforced that we're currently not doing enough of it. And Gavin has very nicely said that we have the capabilities as physiotherapists to get our patients back up and running. Thank you very much.
Now, thanks to Amy Fagan and also to Professor Lieberman, Gavin Williams, and